June 22nd, 1941, just after sunrise. Near the village of Dubno, western Ukraine, the ground trembles under a line of advancing German Panzer III tanks, metal beasts growling through tall grass slick with dew. Overhead, the sky is brushed with summer haze. The long-anticipated Operation Barbarossa is finally in motion, and the 11th Panzer Division charges eastward, sure of one thing: Soviet armor won't stand a chance. Inside one of the lead tanks, 2-year-old Hauptmann Erich Stahl leans into his periscope. "Clear road. Farmhouses ahead," he says calmly into the intercom. His crew grins. This is going as expected. Months of training. Perfect coordination. The Germans have crushed Poland, rolled through France, and now they're about to steamroll Russia. But that belief won't survive the hour. Just beyond a stretch of birch trees, where the road curves into the forest, the first explosion erupts. Boom! One of Stahl's flanking tanks goes up in flames, not from a mine, not from a Stuka mishap, but from something else, something waiting in the woods. The radio crackles with static and shouting. Stahl pivots his periscope. Smoke, fire, and then movement. It doesn't look like any Soviet tank he's seen before. No riveted plates, no thin armor or narrow tracks. This machine moves like a predator. Its silhouette is low and slanted, its armor angled in ways Stahl doesn't recognize, and its gun bigger than expected. Much bigger. "Was ist das?" he mutters. Another shot. A second German tank erupts, turret spinning off like a kicked can. Panic sets in. Stahl yells, "Reverse! Get back behind the rise!" But the new Soviet tank is already advancing. Fast. Too fast for something that size. It climbs the soft terrain with ease, wide tracks floating over the mud that German tanks sink in. The German 37mm shells bounce off its sloped armor like stones. It's a T-34. And on this day, the first day of the German invasion, it's about to rewrite the rules of tank warfare. Across the entire 1,800-mile Eastern Front, reports begin flooding in. Field commanders whisper of a Soviet tank that can't be stopped, not with current weapons. German anti-tank guns, the trusted PaK 36 seconds, fire again and again and fail to penetrate. They call it the door knocker now, mocking its useless clang on enemy armor. And what's worse, this isn't some rare prototype. Soviet rail yards are full of them. Dozens, then hundreds. Berlin doesn't believe it at first. High command dismisses the stories as exaggeration. But then the wreckage comes in. Burned-out panzers. Entire units halted in their tracks. Crews shocked, shaken, furious. The T-34 doesn't just resist, it hunts. With its sloped frontal plate, 45mm armor behaves like much more. Shells deflect. Shots fail. It's fast, thanks to a powerful V2 diesel engine. And its wide tracks mean it glides over the muddy Soviet countryside terrain that bogs German machines for days. Stahl survives the day, barely. His tank, disabled by a side hit, is abandoned in a wheat field. He and his crew escape on foot, stumbling west as the smell of fuel and scorched metal fills the morning air. Later, he'll write home about the tank that came from nowhere. "It was like a wolf among sheep," he scribbles. Ours never stood a chance. Before June 22nd, the German army had reason to be confident. Blitzkrieg had worked lightning war, fast armor, quick victories. But by sunset, that confidence is cracked, because something else now moves in the forests and fields of Russia. A new shape, a new sound, and soon a new fear. Its name is whispered across battalion radios that night, often mispronounced but always repeated. T-34. And by the time Berlin believes in it, it will already be too late. By July 1941, the legend was already spreading. German infantrymen in Belarus huddled around campfires at night, sharing stories they weren't sure they believed. Tales of shells bouncing off tank hulls, of Russian armor appearing through smoke like ghosts, and of entire panzer columns halted by a single enemy vehicle. They had a name for it now. T-34. Short, sharp, unfamiliar. It didn't sound dangerous until you saw one coming straight at you. South of Smolensk, Oberleutnant Karl Bremer's unit found that out the hard way. It was supposed to be a routine sweep, mop up remnants of a retreating Soviet division, secure a road junction, and wait for fuel trucks. But what came instead was a nightmare. Bremer's Panzer IVs, the pride of German armor, crept into a small village just before dusk. The fields were quiet, no return fire, just the buzz of insects and the low rumble of their own engines. Then came the flash. A German tank on the left flank exploded in a ball of fire, its ammo rack igniting with a sound like tearing metal. Before anyone could react, another was hit, the turret lifted off as if swatted by an invisible hand. Bremer slammed the hatch shut and screamed, "Back! Smoke!" But smoke wouldn't help them now. The enemy wasn't attacking from a hilltop or open field. It was hiding, waiting. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a camouflaged T-34 had set up the perfect ambush, and now it was moving. One soldier watching from a ditch later described it like this: "It didn't look like a tank. It looked like something alive. The way it moved through the trees. Smooth, quiet, like it was hunting." It was no longer about tactics. It was about survival. In Berlin, alarm bells were ringing louder. General Heinz Guderian, father of Germany's armored warfare doctrine, demanded answers. Reports from the front no longer bragged about victories, they pleaded for upgrades. The Panzer III's 37mm gun was practically useless against this new Soviet armor. Even the heavier Panzer IVs struggled unless they landed a lucky shot from the side or rear. And yet, German soldiers kept fighting. They adapted. Some tried to sneak around the flanks and fire at the engine deck. Others called in airstrikes, but nothing felt reliable anymore. The T-34 changed the very rhythm of war. With its Christie suspension and diesel engine, it outran nearly everything on the field. While German tanks had to halt and shift gears to cross trenches or ditches, the T-34 rolled over them like a tractor. Its turret, mounted low on a cast dome, gave it a compact silhouette hard to spot, harder to hit. And its gun, the 76.2mm F-34, could crack German armor open from over a kilometer away. More than once, German tank crews climbed out of their destroyed vehicles and walked toward what they assumed must have been a heavy tank, a KV-1 maybe, or something new entirely, only to find a medium-sized machine, soot-streaked, still warm to the touch, surrounded by shell fragments that hadn't even scratched the surface. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The Soviet Union was thought to be backward, poorly organized, using outdated equipment. Instead, the Germans had walked into something they didn't expect: a battlefield where the enemy had the better machine. And the worst part? The T-34 wasn't rare. By the end of summer, Soviet factories in Kharkov and Stalingrad were producing hundreds. Despite retreats and encirclements, despite sabotage and Luftwaffe raids, assembly lines continued. Soviet workers, many of them women and teenagers, labored day and night under blackout conditions. Welding torches lit up rail yards, the clang of steel echoing in the dark. They knew what was at stake. The Red Army wasn't winning, not yet, but it wasn't breaking either. And everywhere the Germans advanced, the T-34 followed. Abandoned villages, forest clearings, railroad crossings. Tank crews began spotting them not in ones or twos, but in squads, sometimes full companies. Every German breakthrough was now a race. Take the ground fast enough, or face the counterattack before refueling. And with every battle, one truth grew clearer. Germany's tanks were no longer the hunters. They were being hunted. August 1941. Inside a staff meeting at the Army High Command in Berlin, tension filled the room like smoke. Maps covered in red pins stretched across eastern Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. Reports lay stacked on the table, each one more alarming than the last. General Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, set his glasses down and rubbed his temples. "We are not dealing with the same enemy as in Poland," he said flatly. "And this tank," he tapped the paper, "this T-34, it's something else entirely." The men in the room knew it was true. Since the invasion began, German forces had captured thousands of Soviet tanks, but most were outdated models, barely functional. The T-34 was different. It didn't just resist, it dominated, and it was appearing in growing numbers. Berlin's confidence, once soaring with the easy victories of Blitzkrieg, had cracked. Worse yet, there was no easy fix. The standard German anti-tank guns, like the 37mm Pak-36, were nearly useless against the T-34's sloped armor. Even the newer 50mm rounds required dangerously close distances to penetrate. The problem, one munitions officer said quietly, is not just the armor, it's how it's shaped. The T-34's armor wasn't thicker than German tanks, it was smarter. Soviet engineers had designed its plates with a slope, giving the illusion of a smaller target, while increasing the chance that incoming shells would ricochet. A 45mm angled plate could deflect rounds as effectively as a much thicker flat one. It was basic geometry, but on the battlefield, it was life or death. The Wehrmacht had nothing like it. German tanks were boxy, with vertical armor that invited punishment. And because their tanks ran on gasoline, they were more prone to catching fire when hit a deadly vulnerability against the T-34's powerful 76.2mm gun. German crews began referring to the T-34 as a phantom, a tank that seemed to appear and vanish at will, impossible to stop and harder to kill. In the field, the panic was growing. Near Vyazma, a platoon commander wrote in his logbook, "It's not the numbers that frighten us. It's how few of them it takes to hold us back." One of them on a ridge held our entire company for nearly 3 hours. Every shell we fired bounced off. We had to call in Stukas to end it. To counter the T-34, the German High Command scrambled for solutions. Orders went out to reinforce the Panzer IV with longer-barreled 75mm guns, but upgrades take time, and the Eastern Front offered no pause. Engineering teams worked around the clock, studying captured T-34 seconds, testing new armor-piercing rounds, and drafting designs for future vehicles. It wasn't just about building something better, it was about doing it fast. Meanwhile, the Red Army was already adapting. Soviet commanders began organizing armored brigades with large formations of T-34 seconds at the core. They learned to coordinate tanks with artillery and infantry. They hit retreating German units, then vanished into the forest. Guerrilla-style strikes with modern weapons. At the same time, the T-34 was evolving. The initial version with its 2-man turret had limitations. Commanders had to load the gun and lead the crew simultaneously. But even those flaws were being addressed. A more powerful variant was already being tested, one with an 85mm gun and a 3-man turret, based on lessons learned in blood. The Germans couldn't believe it. They had expected to win with overwhelming speed. Instead, they were forced to dig in, fortify, and brace themselves for armored counterattacks. By the fall of 1941, the myth of German invincibility was fading. The muddy seas in Rasputitsa turned roads into rivers of muck. German trucks stalled, tanks sank, and while the Panzers sat trapped in the sludge, T-34 seconds kept moving. Their wide tracks gave them traction the Germans couldn't match. Where Panzer divisions halted, the T-34 seconds advanced. They cut supply lines, they hit fuel depots, they ambushed rear echelons. Suddenly, it wasn't just the tank crews feeling the pressure, it was the entire logistical chain. In a letter home, a German mechanic wrote, "Our tanks are freezing, the engines seize up, but the Russians, their tanks don't stop. The T-34 seconds roll past us in the snow, covered in frost, like they belong in this land." That line stuck, because that was the truth no one wanted to admit. The T-34 didn't just outgun the Germans. It belonged in the very soil they were fighting on, and the deeper the Wehrmacht pushed into Russia, the more often they found it waiting. October 1942. The Volga River. Stalingrad. The eastern sky glowed red long before sunrise. Smoke from days of shelling hung low over the ruined city, turning morning light into something dull and grim. On the western bank of the Volga, Soviet crews huddled in shallow bunkers, waiting for their turn to cross. Among them sat Junior Lieutenant Andrei Besanov, just 22, already a veteran of 4 tank battles. Beside him, half buried under camouflage netting, was his T-34 hull scratched, exhaust blackened, tracks still crusted with dried mud from the previous day's fighting. It was the only one in his platoon still running. He clutched a flask in his gloves, hands trembling not from cold but from the memory of the screams echoing in his headset the day before, when his commander's tank took a direct hit and vanished into fire. But there was no time to mourn. The Germans were inside Stalingrad now. Across the shattered city, house by house, floor by floor, the Sixth Army pushed forward. But nothing came easy. Soviet resistance was stubborn, coordinated, and inhumanly determined. The ruins had become their ally, every crater a foxhole, every factory a fortress. And amidst this chaos, like sharks in shallow water, roamed the T-34 seconds. They weren't rolling across open fields anymore. Now they crept through alleys. They crashed through walls. They hid inside bombed-out buildings, waiting for a Panzer to roll past, then striking from the rear. Urban combat turned everything upside down. Range no longer mattered. Tactics shifted from maneuvers to raw instinct. And the T-34 adapted better than anyone expected. It was compact enough to fit through narrow streets. Its diesel engine didn't ignite as easily when struck, and its wide tracks kept it mobile, even over rubble and fire-charred brick. The Germans were stunned. Again. They had hoped to wear down Soviet armor through attrition, but the T-34 seconds kept coming, sometimes patched with scrap metal, sometimes manned by crews who had only trained for a few days. It didn't matter. They fought like they had something to prove because they did. This was their city, their soil, their war. In the heart of Stalingrad, the Red October factory became a symbol of something more than production. It became a battleground. German infantry reported that the Soviets were rolling tanks straight off the assembly line into combat. Some T-34 seconds went into battle unpainted, still warm from welding, their hulls stenciled with chalked numbers. One crew even entered combat without a main gun sight, aiming through the barrel by instinct alone. It sounded like desperation. It was. But it worked, because they weren't trying to win individual battles anymore. They were trying to buy time every hour, every block, a chance for the Red Army to regroup, for winter to come, for reinforcements to arrive across the Volga under fire. And with every hour bought, the Germans paid in blood. T-34 crews became folk heroes inside the city. Women in the factories stitched extra insulation into tankers' jackets. Children brought bread to tank yards between air raids. Mechanics worked by candlelight, cannibalizing ruined machines to get one more engine running. And the stories spread. A lone T-34 ambushing a Panzer column from behind a collapsed apartment building. A driver navigating through a sewer line to escape encirclement. Crews continuing to fight with scorched faces, breathing through torn shirts, shells still clanging off their armor. The Germans saw it too. Their intelligence officers began documenting Soviet repair rates. For every 3 tanks lost, 1 or 2 were back in action within days. Field units started recognizing specific hull numbers, tanks that had been destroyed twice and returned to fight again. It wasn't just machinery anymore. The T-34 had become a symbol of Soviet resilience. By December, German hopes of taking Stalingrad were fading. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive, had begun, encircling the Sixth Army. From the steppes north and south of the city, entire armored corps surged forward, hundreds of T-34 seconds in coordinated waves. The Germans tried to respond, but fuel was low. Crews were exhausted. Panzers bogged in snow. Radios failed. And still the T-34 seconds kept moving, swarming flanks, breaking rear lines, sealing the trap. Stalingrad would not fall. And when the final German surrender came in February 1943, one truth was painfully clear to every officer who walked into Soviet captivity. They hadn't just lost to men. They'd lost to a machine that wouldn't quit. March 1943. The outskirts of Kharkov. A bitter wind howled across the open fields as Soviet tanks rolled forward again, but something had changed. German defenses had regrouped. Reinforcements had arrived. And for the first time since Stalingrad, the Red Army was being pushed back. The Wehrmacht struck with precision. New weapons appeared on the field. The Panzer IVs had been upgunned. And worse, something darker, heavier now stalked the lines. The Tiger I. Its 88mm cannon could destroy a T-34 from well beyond visual range. Its thick armor was impervious to the standard Soviet gun. When one appeared near Belgorod, an entire T-34 platoon was knocked out before closing the distance. The Soviets had fought fire with grit. Now they needed steel to match it. And they delivered. In a small design bureau outside Gorky, engineers had already begun work on a major upgrade. It wasn't just a new weapon, it was a full transformation. The answer wasn't to replace the T-34. It was to evolve it. Enter the T-34 divided by 85. It retained the same rugged frame, the same trusted diesel engine, and the same battlefield mobility that had made the original a legend. But above the turret ring, everything was different. A new three-man turret cast, rounded and spacious, now housed a more powerful 85mm gun. This allowed the commander to focus on leading instead of loading, drastically improving coordination in combat. It also meant Soviet crews could finally face German heavy tanks on something closer to equal footing. It wasn't a perfect match for the Tiger no Soviet tank was, one-on-one. But war isn't fought one-on-one. It's fought in numbers. And now the Red Army had a weapon that could swarm, survive, and strike back with deadly force. By early 1944, the T-34 divided by 85 began rolling off assembly lines in full force. Dozens became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands. Soviet factories had recovered from the shock of 1941. Many had been relocated behind the Urals, and now they were running around the clock. In one report from factory number 183, located in Nizhny Tagil, it was said that crews could weld a full turret into place in just 40 minutes. Each day brought more tanks, more replacements, more waves of armored steel ready to drive west. On the front lines, the impact was immediate. During the battles around Kovel and Tarnopol, German commanders noted a sharp increase in Soviet tank resistance. The new turret profile made it harder to knock out the T-34 with a single hit. The new gun could punch through a Panzer IV at 1,000 meters. The battlefield dynamic had shifted once again. For Soviet crews, the upgrade was personal. Many had lost friends in the open plains of 1,941 and 1,942, where they fired hopelessly at tigers and panthers, watching rounds bounce like pebbles. Now, they had a fighting chance. Lieutenant Mikhail Sokolov, a tank commander from the 3rd Guards Tank Army, wrote to his family in May 1944, "Our new gun has teeth. The enemy still has sharper claws, but they bleed now when we hit them." It wasn't bravado. It was relief. The German response was predictable. They built bigger. The Panther was introduced. Then came the King Tiger, each heavier, more powerful, more expensive. But that was part of the problem. Germany was building tanks like watches, precise, complex, and fragile under pressure. The Soviets were building hammers. The T-34 divided by 85 could be manufactured in huge numbers. It didn't need perfect conditions. It didn't need a polished factory floor. It just needed steel, workers, and time. And it got all three. By mid-1944, the Red Army had fully integrated the new variant into its armored corps. Entire brigades were re-equipped. Tactics shifted. They no longer needed to sneak behind heavy tanks or rely on artillery to break through. They could go head-to-head. And more importantly, they could keep going. Every time a T-34 was destroyed, there were 5 more waiting behind it. And every new crew entered the fight, knowing they had a machine that could bring them home. In July 1944, during Operation Bagration, the T-34 divided by 85 led the charge through Belarus, smashing through German lines at an astonishing pace. Bridges were captured before they could be blown. Roads were cleared by armored wedges. And in the rear-view mirror of every retreating Panzer crew, there was one silhouette they kept seeing again and again. Sloped, wide, with the rising barrel of an 85mm gun. The T-34 had evolved, and now it was coming home. August 1944, Eastern Poland. The sky was low and heavy. clouds hanging over the horizon like a curtain waiting to lift. On a dusty farm road outside Lublin, a column of T-34 divided by 85 seconds rumbled westward. Their tracks threw up dry soil. Their engines droned like an unbroken chord. Above each turret fluttered a faded red flag, marked with dust and diesel soot. To the civilians who peeked from shattered barns and burnt-out homes, the tanks meant survival. To the Germans ahead, they meant something else entirely. By this point, the Red Army wasn't crawling anymore, it was sprinting. The German lines were overstretched, battered, and exhausted. After Operation Bagration, entire army groups had been destroyed. What remained fell back through Poland and the Baltic states, hoping to regroup. But every time they turned around, the T-34 seconds were there, pushing, pressing, never stopping. Soviet doctrine had evolved with the tank. Gone were the desperate, undersupported charges of 1,941. Now came coordinated assaults, combined arms offensives, built around speed and encirclement. Infantry rode the decks of T-34 seconds into towns. Engineers followed with pontoons. Artillery softened targets before the tanks punched through, and behind them came supply trucks, repair crews, fuel convoys, a whole army in motion. When the Vistula was crossed and the approach to Warsaw began, the T-34 seconds led the way. Even in the face of German Panther divisions, they struck hard and fast. While the Panthers had better optics and more firepower, they were slower, more prone to breakdown, and produced in far fewer numbers. The T-34 didn't need to win duels, it needed to keep moving. And move it did. During the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, Soviet tanks advanced over 300 miles in just 3 weeks. The weather was brutal. Snow fell like ash. Roads froze overnight. But the T-34 seconds pushed on. Their diesel engines handled the cold. Their wide tracks gripped frozen terrain. Their crews wrapped themselves in blankets and sheepskin, knowing rest would only come when the next town was taken. German soldiers, fresh from the Ardennes, were pulled east only to find a different kind of battle waiting for them. Where in France they had time to prepare ambushes and reinforce towns, in Poland and Prussia, the Red Army gave them none. The T-34 seconds hit like hammers. Town after town fell Radom, Łódź, Poznań. At times, forward Soviet units outran their own fuel trucks. They took fuel from abandoned Wehrmacht depots, captured bread, poured antifreeze from German canisters into their own engines. There was no elegance, just momentum. By the time the Oder River was reached in February 1945, Berlin was less than 50 miles away. Snowmelt ran through the trenches. Smoke hung low across the fields. And the tanks, hundreds of them, lined up once again. A German officer later wrote, "It was as if the ground itself rolled toward us. Not waves, but a tide. Gray-green hulls, all the same shape. Sloped, determined, silent until they fired." The Soviet command prepared for the final push. Engineers built pontoon bridges by moonlight. Infantry units rehearsed street fighting, and the T-34 seconds were refueled, rearmed, and positioned for the final blow. But something had changed in the tone of war. The early war desperation was gone. The tanks no longer bore scratches from emergency repairs or patchwork camouflage from 1,942. Now they were uniform, maintained, polished even, some crews marking their turrets with kill counts and chalk slogans, "Za Rodinu," for the motherland. For the tankers, Berlin was not just a city. It was a destination 3 years in the making. On April 16th, 1945, the Berlin offensive began. Over 20,000 Soviet tanks participated, the majority of them T-34 seconds. They crossed rivers under fire. They blasted through the Silo Heights. They pushed into the suburbs with infantry clinging to their hulls. And as German defenses crumbled, street by street, block by block, the T-34 seconds kept coming. Inside the Reichstag district, buildings collapsed onto avenues choked with wreckage. Shellfire echoed like thunder. In alleyways, tanks turned corners blind. In courtyards, they fired point blank. In cellars, Soviet crews, shouted orders through smoke as they cleared floors above with infantry. One Berlin civilian later recalled, "The ground shook. You could hear them before you saw them. That deep growl. And then suddenly, they were there, the red stars, the sloped armor, the machine that never stopped." By May, the war in Europe was nearly over, and the tank that had been dismissed, doubted, and underestimated in 1941, the T-34, now stood at the heart of the victory. It didn't do it alone, but without it, that road from Stalingrad to Berlin might never have been walked at all. In a war where seconds meant survival and machinery could decide the fate of nations, the T-34 was never just a tank. It was a promise that the Red Army would not stop. What made it so effective wasn't any one feature. It was how all the parts worked together, not perfectly, but well enough and reliably enough to keep fighting, no matter the conditions. The genius of the T-34 wasn't in flawless craftsmanship or advanced technology. It was in its balance. When German engineers first examined captured T-34 seconds, they were surprised. The welds weren't elegant. The optics were crude compared to Zeiss scopes. The ergonomics inside were tight, even uncomfortable. But what struck them was how simple it all was, and how well it performed under pressure. Start with the armor. The sloped 45mm plate on the front of the early T-34 acted like much more in combat. Incoming shells were more likely to deflect than penetrate, especially from the common 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns of 1941-42. Later, the T-34, divided by 85-75mm front plate and its new rounded turret, could withstand even direct hits from Panther and Tiger I tanks if struck at the right angle or from medium distance. Its V2 diesel engine was another breakthrough. While most German tanks ran on gasoline, which burned hot and ignited easily, the T-34's diesel was safer, cooler, and more efficient. This mattered more than most realize. Crews hit by enemy fire had a better chance of surviving, and in bitter winters, the T-34 started more reliably than almost anything the Germans had. Then came the suspension. The T-34 used the Christie suspension, a system that gave it exceptional mobility across rough ground. It could roll over trenches, debris, and snowfields without hesitation. When spring rains turned roads into rivers of mud, German tanks got stuck. Soviet T-34 seconds just kept going. Even the wide tracks played a role. German tank designers had focused on narrower profiles to fit railcars and roads. The T-34's broader tracks spread weight better, reducing pressure per square inch. This let it travel across softer terrain, forests, farmland, swamps where German tanks bogged down. Inside, it was a different story. The T-34 wasn't comfortable. Crews had little room to stretch. The controls were basic. Some early models lacked radios entirely, relying on signal flags or runners. Visibility was limited, and the gunner and commander often had to multitask under fire. But Soviet tankers adapted. They learned to move quickly, to communicate without words, to trust instinct over elegance. And the Soviets learned how to build them fast. Production was never about perfecting a design, it was about putting steel on the field as quickly as possible. Soviet factories were stripped down to the essentials. Workers skipped polishing and finishing. Every minute saved in the factory meant more tanks at the front. Even the components were interchangeable across models, simplifying repairs. At the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, nicknamed Tankograd, production lines ran non-stop. Some workers slept in the factory. Others brought their children, who helped sort parts and sweep floors. In 1943 alone, Soviet industry produced more than 15,000 tons 34 seconds. By 1945, that number had soared to over 57,000. No other tank came close. But numbers only told part of the story. What truly made the T-34 relentless was the relationship between machine and crew. Soviet tankers named their vehicles Revenge, Mother Russia, for Ivan. They painted them with chalk slogans before charging into battle. Crews often stayed together from training to combat, forming bonds that turned cold steel into something personal. A crew might eat together, sleep beside the tank, and fight inside it for weeks on end. When one was lost, It wasn't just a number. It was a friend, a brother. Sometimes, after a tank was knocked out, surviving crew members would return at night under fire to retrieve a gun sight or a flag just to carry it into their next vehicle. The T-34 became more than a weapon. It was a companion, flawed, loud, imperfect but faithful. Years later, German commanders would admit they had underestimated it. Not because they couldn't outgun it in some cases, but because it never went away. Even after a victory, even after pushing Soviet lines back, the next day brought another wave of them, covered in mud, painted with whitewash for winter, sometimes patched with spare sheet metal, but still rumbling forward. Tank for tank, the T-34 wasn't the best machine on the battlefield. But war doesn't reward perfection. It rewards endurance. And the T-34 endured. March 1945, east of Küstrin, Germany. Snow still clung to the edges of the woods, though the roads had turned to mud. A column of T-34 divided by 85 seconds idled along the tree line, engines rumbling like breath from giants. Inside the lead tank, Senior Sergeant Ivan Malyshev pulled his wool cap tight and checked the breech one more time. He was on his third T-34. His first had burned outside Kharkov in 1943. His second was knocked out in Hungary. But here he was alive, somehow 2 years and thousands of kilometers later, rolling toward Berlin. Malyshev didn't think of himself as a hero. He smoked cheap cigarettes, cursed the cold, and missed his family like every other man. But when the hatch slammed shut and the engine roared to life, he became something else, part of a crew, part of a machine, part of a force that no longer stopped for anything. The T-34 was built tough, but the men inside had to be tougher. Crews worked in shifts with barely any rest. They ate cold food when they had it, slept in the turret when they couldn't dig in. In the freezing winters of the Eastern Front, ice formed on the inside of the armor. In summer, the metal hull baked like an oven. There were no heaters, no luxuries. The loader, always the youngest, had to wrestle heavy shells into the breech, even as the turret rattled from every bump. The gunner focused on targets through a blurry scope. The driver, crouched low, gripped the levers, bracing every bone in his body for impacts he couldn't avoid. Communication was often limited to shouts, slaps on the shoulder, or gut instincts. Inside a T-34 during combat, there was no space to panic. Only the next move. Only survival. And yet, morale stayed high. Not because the war was easy, but because they believed it had to be done. After all, many of these men had seen their homes destroyed, their families killed or deported. The land they fought through wasn't foreign. It was once theirs, and they meant to take it back. Stories from the front told of remarkable courage, often unrecorded by history. There was the crew near Kursk who, with their turret jammed, charged a German position in reverse and fired using only the machine gun. Another, outside Minsk, drove for 3 hours on bare steel rims after their tracks had been blown off just to deliver ammunition to encircled infantry. Some tankers fought through entire campaigns with burns on their hands and arms from earlier fights, refusing medical evacuation because it meant abandoning their crew. Among the most respected were the tank commanders, young men given terrifying responsibility. They were often in their early 20s, sometimes even teenagers, but had to lead older men into battle, make split-second decisions, and keep the crew alive. They memorized terrain maps, knew the sound of enemy guns by ear, and could spot the silhouette of a Panther from a single glance through smoke. One such commander, Lieutenant Dmitry Kalinin, had his turret struck 3 times in one day during the battle for Budapest. His loader was killed instantly. The radio burned out. But Kalinin stayed in the fight, firing manually, giving commands through raw shouts. He made it out. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union. But medals weren't what they fought for. They fought for the man sitting next to them, for the voices on the other end of the headset, for the road home. As the Red Army neared Berlin, those crews had become veterans of the deadliest ground war in history. They had crossed rivers under artillery fire, charged machine gun nests, rammed enemy tanks when their shells ran dry. They had buried friends and kept going. When they entered Germany, they saw what was on the other side of the war. Towns untouched by fire, barns filled with food, homes with painted walls and warm beds. It made many angry. It made some quiet. But they pressed on, because they had one job left. And their tanks, scratched, dented, soot-streaked, were still rolling. To understand the success of the T-34, you can study the design, the numbers, the battlefield tactics. But none of it matters without the men inside. They made the impossible possible. They took a steel box and turned it into a spear. And when it was time to finish the fight, they drove it straight through the heart of a continent. April 1945. The smell of wet brick, scorched paper, and diesel hung over Berlin like a final warning. Columns of smoke curled into the gray sky as T-34 seconds rolled through the city's outer districts, not with speed now, but with a steady, crushing weight. The war that began with German tanks racing east had now come full circle. And the same men who once mocked the T-34, who laughed at its crude welds, its boxy frame, its simplicity, were now hiding from its unmistakable growl echoing through the broken streets. Inside a cellar beneath what had once been a bakery in Neukölln, Oberfeldwebel Karl Brenner wiped soot from his face and listened. He heard the crunch of tracks over shattered glass. Then came the sudden stop, the brief silence. Then the report of a main gun shaking the walls like thunder. Dust fell from the rafters. Someone 2 rooms over began to sob. "They're here," Brenner muttered. And they were. German tank crews knew it long before Berlin. They'd seen it in the ruins of Warsaw, in the forests of Belarus, in the plains of Hungary. The T-34 wasn't just durable, it was unrelenting. No matter how many were destroyed, more followed. And now, at the very gates of the Reich, it was clear. The Soviets had not run out of tanks or men. Those fighting in the remnants of Panzer divisions were using whatever was left. Some had Tigers or Panthers with engine issues they couldn't fix. Others used outdated Panzer IVs, hopelessly outmatched by the newer T-34 divided by 85 seconds. Ammunition was low. Fuel was rationed. Morale was worse. They fought, yes. They fought bravely, but they knew. They had spent years learning how to flank the T-34, how to aim for the weak spots, how to take them out from distance, but they could never overcome the numbers. They never matched the production. And by the time the T-34 seconds reached Berlin, all those tactical lessons had become academic. It was too late. Captured German officers, questioned after the war, spoke with quiet respect and sometimes disbelief about what they had faced. Many admitted they had underestimated the Soviets from the start. They believed Russia would collapse, that its army would fall apart, that its weapons, like its people, were backward and broken. But the Eastern Front humbled them. Because the T-34 wasn't just a better tank, it was a reflection of an industrial system built for war, a reflection of a population willing to endure, and a reflection of a military that learned quickly, adapted, and refused to die. One German major, during an Allied debrief, famously remarked, "We thought the Russians would come in rags. They came in steel." By late April, Soviet forces had surrounded Berlin from all sides. T-34 seconds spearheaded thrusts into the heart of the city, clearing intersections, supporting infantry, and rolling through barricades like they were matchsticks. German civilians emerged from basements to find T-34 seconds parked in their streets, their crews eating from mess kits or sleeping beside the tracks. Some locals feared retribution. Others simply stared curious about the machines that had crossed half a continent. To them, the T-34 wasn't a symbol of design genius. It was a symbol of inevitability. Inside the Führer bunker, word arrived that Soviet tanks had reached the Reichstag. It was over. The last order was issued. Surrender, or die in place. For the Wehrmacht soldiers who still held rifles, it was no longer a matter of battle. It was survival. They had seen what the Soviets had endured, what they'd bled for, and many knew that no amount of training or courage could stand against that kind of resolve. When the fighting stopped on May 2nd and Berlin finally fell, some of the first Soviet vehicles to drive through the Brandenburg Gate were T-34 seconds engines coughing, armor streaked with mud and smoke, turrets turned slightly, as if still scanning for threats. The war in Europe had begun with German tanks punching deep into Russian territory. It ended with Russian tanks parked in the heart of Berlin, not by chance, not by miracle, but by fire, steel, and sacrifice. May 9th, 1945, Red Square, Moscow. The sky was pale blue, and for the first time in nearly 4 years, it didn't smell of smoke. Crowds gathered by the thousands. Children hoisted onto shoulders. Women waved flowers. Veterans stood in uniform, their medals catching the morning light. And when the tanks rumbled across the cobblestones, people cheered. It wasn't ceremony that stirred them, it was memory. The T-34 seconds rolling past Lenin's tomb weren't parade models. They were battlefield survivors, still dented, still soot-streaked. Some had names or kill counts scrawled in chalk on their turrets. And in every tank, a crew who had lived to see peace. Across the Soviet Union, and beyond the image of the T-34, came to define what victory looked like. Not a gleaming monument or abstract symbol, but something real, tangible, forged in hardship, born in fire, and carried across a continent. But even as the war ended, the T-34's journey wasn't over. Long after Berlin fell, the T-34 continued to serve. It became the backbone of Soviet-aligned armies across Eastern Europe, Asia, and parts of the Middle East. From Prague to Pyongyang, its silhouette appeared on posters, currency, and in military parades. In Korea, T-34 seconds rolled across the 38th parallel in 1950, leading the North Korean invasion. American troops, many of whom had never seen combat against Soviet equipment, found themselves staring down a machine built for a different war, but still deadly. In Vietnam, T-34 seconds were used for training and coastal defense. In the Middle East, they were shipped to Egypt and Syria. Some even served in Africa and Latin America, modified, repainted, refitted, but still recognizable. That distinct sloped hull, that unmistakable turret. By some estimates, over 80,000 tons 34 seconds were built. No tank in history was produced in greater numbers, and even fewer lasted so long. But legacy isn't measured in steel alone. The true weight of the T-34's story lies in what it represents. For the Soviets, it was a symbol of resistance, the machine that stood when everything else had fallen, when cities were surrounded, when factories were burning, when the enemy was at the gates. It gave soldiers a fighting chance. It gave civilians a symbol of hope. For the Germans who faced it, it was a wake-up call. Proof that victory wasn't decided by clever strategy alone, but by who could endure, adapt, and outlast. For the world, it marked a turning point. A reminder that good design doesn't need to be complicated. That simplicity, when combined with purpose, can shape history. Today, decades after its engine last roared in combat, the T-34 still sits in museums and memorials across Europe and Asia. Some are preserved in glass halls. Others stand outdoors, their paint faded, their tracks frozen in time. Tourists climb atop them for photos. Veterans place flowers beside them. Children stare through periscopes, unaware they're looking into history's most enduring war machine. And somewhere, deep in forests across Eastern Europe, a few still rest rusted, overgrown with moss and ivy, forgotten by time but never by what they represent. In the end, the T-34 wasn't perfect. Its optics were limited. Its armor had weak spots. Its early models lacked radios and proper ergonomics. Crews often suffered, and its losses were high. But it did what it had to do. It fought from the swamps of Belarus to the ruins of Berlin. It withstood the tiger's bite, the panther's shell, the long winter nights and summer dust. It was driven by boys who became men, by soldiers who knew they might not come back, but climbed in anyway. And when the dust finally settled, when the last guns fell silent, it was still standing. That's how legends are made. Not by perfection, but by persistence,